For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 3, Episode 18 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami, our preview of the Innovations in NAFLD Care 2022 conference, starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
This isn't just there's a lot of people with fatty liver disease and we need to do something about it. It's epidemiology for action.
I'd like to really empower the other co-physicians, or the physicians that see most of these patients, actually, the endocrinologists and the primary care, to get a strategy or to get to know the strategy on how to address these patients. And not to worry about all patients they're seeing, because they're seeing a lot. Jeff mentioned up to 70%.
One of the things I used to see over and over again in marketing research, really everywhere in the world we work, was that doctors had somewhere between frustration and contempt for obese patients that couldn't lose weight. You know, that it was obviously a problem of willpower. We're now starting to understand that obesity is a disease, but there's a real miss on communication there.
This is at the heart of the physician-patient interaction. The physician is the one that informs the patient and leaves him the choice to do with it what he wants to do with it. But for this, we have to have all the information. We got to enable our patients to then act or not act, which is their choice.
This is a session where you're going to hear about future pharmacotherapeutics. You're going to get what you often get at other meetings, but you're going to get a lot more because we're going to be talking about the multidisciplinary management. We're going to be engaging with patients. We're going to be looking at NAFLD in other settings. So these are the settings that are going to be referring patients in need to you. It's an amazing faculty. We're going to be in Barcelona.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. This week, join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader, Professor Jörn Schattenberg, public health researcher and key opinion leader, Professor Jeffrey Lazarus, and pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, as they preview next month's inaugural Innovations in NAFLD Care 2022 conference, this week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Для всіх, хто цікавиться мережею NASH або загалом жировою хворобою печінки, ловіть хвилю.
So first of all, I'd like to thank again Anna Tokar for making our opening statement in Ukrainian so that we can start every podcast remembering the Ukraine. And ironically, Anna came to us because she's a former student of Jeff Lazarus, and Jeff is with us today. So Jeff, let me just start before we do anything else by saying thanks for introducing us to Anna, who did that, and then translated English into Ukrainian slowly enough that I can close in the end with Ukrainian salutations and not sound completely dreadful. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, Anna was my PhD student working on HIV issues for a while. We shared an office. She graduated as my first PhD student at the Barcelona Institute for Global Health, went on to become a WHO consultant, and now her life is turned completely upside down from what should have been one of her great moments of becoming a doctor and getting a job with WHO. Now she's fully immersed in the response to what's going on in Ukraine.
At some point, I might invite her to come on for 15 minutes and just tell our listeners about what that entails, because I think if you're not in parts of the world you don't know, and we happen to have audiences in places where it's not clear the news is getting through. Let's just leave it at that. But that's not why we're here today. We're here today to talk about the conference. This is a small group. Louise, who is virtually always with us, is not, because she's landing in Australia as we speak. Her second home, a place she hasn't been since the pandemic. She'll be with us from down under next week, but unfortunately couldn't make this one. Stephen is engaged in the ongoing work of running 2 trial sites, several companies, publishing articles, and helping Nail NIT get up and running, and we'll have more on Nail NIT next week. And it struck me that there were exactly 2 people who were really well qualified to discuss this topic, and they're both here. So, Jeff, I think this is your 4th or 5th time on the podcast, if I recall correctly, all in the context of global health and NAFLD, and welcome back. Always good to have you with us. And obviously, Jörn is with us a whole bunch more than that. Jörn, it's probably only your 4th or 5th in the last 6 weeks, just guessing, or something like that.
Good evening, Roger. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks always. Your contributions are always just superb. These gents both have at least 7 or 8 things they do on any given weekly basis, but among them are co-chairing next month's inaugural Interventions in NAFLD Care 2022 conference, which does something I've not seen yet in a limited scope meeting, which is to bring the many streams of fatty liver therapeutics, research, treatment, patient support, public health, all that into a single day-and-a-half conference, which struck me when I heard about it initially as an ambitious goal, but then again, ambitious isn't news for either Jeff or Jörn either. I thought this would be cool because we never get to, at least I, never get to watch the whys and hows of how a new conference or new publication comes together. But this is the inaugural conference, and today we're going to do exactly that. Talk about why this conference is happening and what the two co-principals set out to do, and then walk through the agenda item by item and see how they fit into that picture. Now, my disclosure is I've been honored by these two gents to be invited to moderate a panel titled Exchanging and Sharing Ideas on the NAFLD-NASH Roadmap, including social media and digital transformation of healthcare. Those of you who know me know that's not a title that I selected because it's a little long for what I would have done, but it's pretty complete, and it gives us a lot of scope. That said, we're not going to spend an inappropriately large amount of time today talking about that panel. I think we want to talk about the whole event. Before we get started, just kind of basic groundbreaker, one good personal thing, one good professional thing that's happened in your lives in the last week. Brave one, go first.
I'll jump in. Good thing that's happened. I just had the opportunity to spend some time in Sevilla with one of the great hepatologists there, Manuel Romero Gomez, who had experts from across Spain talking about hepatitis C and engaging with the authorities and the younger generation of liver experts there. And it was just really exciting just to see, we sit so much in the office, and the last couple of years we haven't been able to travel so much, but just to see on the ground what they're doing about hepatitis. The same group is engaged in NAFLD. And so it was just good to touch base on how they're trying to keep that a priority during the pandemic and as we start to hopefully move a bit out of it.
We're just coming out of a cold break again here in Germany. We actually had a snow coming down over the weekend, and sure enough, it was time for a road trip, but we managed that pretty well. I visited some family, so now we're all back in. First day in clinic today. Pretty busy. Actually saw some newly diagnosed patients again, and really, I know it's time to bring this topic and move it forward. And just to lead over, I think this was why I was so excited to hear from Jeff Lazarus about a year ago, I would think, when he came across with all his knowledge on public health. And we've been doing some studies and little projects, and he said, you know what's really missing? I think you got to start talking about how to engage the different parties that are taking care of these patients, but also, of course, public health aspects. And I think this is where it all started out. And we thought about how we could break this together.
Good professional news. We are firming up partnership again with EASL to be a media partner for the ILC coming end of June. It will be an expanded partnership over what we did next year because the technology is approved, because we will actually be on the ground in London, which will make it better. But I'm expecting by the time we get to London, I will already have met everyone I've been working with for the last 2 years. The three people who are left are the two gents on the phone and Louise, and we're hoping to have Louise in Barcelona with us. And obviously, Jörn and Jeff will be in Barcelona with us. So at that point, no one will be a complete stranger anymore. Good thing. Personal news. We have finished teaching my granddaughter how to eat with chopsticks. It's easier to teach at the age of 4 than it is at, say, her mother, who's 37, who can't get it for the life of her. But watching her eat ramen noodles with chopsticks is one of the truly adorable things in my life. It's what we did for dinner last night, and it's a glow that lasts at least 24 hours every time she does it. So it's a small thing, but I think these are some of the things that make life worth living. So in that regard.
Yeah, Roger, it's funny you say that, because last time I tried it, we ended up poking the ravioli and kind of eating it from the stick.
That's funny. I think a lot of it has to do with when you learned. I learned when I was in my late teens, but my wife learned when she was 5 or 6. Her mother just said, you have to do this. So therefore, to my wife, she can remember how she learned when she was 5, and therefore she can teach our granddaughter when she was 5, and it works. Now, that doesn't mean occasionally she doesn't decide it's fun to put her fingers in the soup bowl, but that's just being 4. That's not a lack of proficiency, but that's funny. So let's start. Jörn, you kind of started, but Jeff, since the general vision, I think, initiates with you, you've talked a little bit in past episodes about some of the history and how you got to NASH, but if you could do that again for a minute or 3, putting focus on what it is you learned on the way through that made you feel this conference was such a good idea, or a necessity, or somewhere in the middle, your floor.
I think I'll draw on the title of your podcast, Roger, because I feel like I'm surfing sometimes on the tsunami of one health problem after another. And I mentioned probably last time or the time before that I started my work in global public health and HIV, living in New York City at the end of the 1980s. Everyone knew about the AIDS epidemic. The question was, what were we going to do about it? When I later moved to WHO at the end of the 90s, I worked on HIV. As we started to get that under control, I moved into hepatitis C because we realized we were providing antiretroviral therapy to many people who are going to have liver problems because hepatitis C, like HIV, is a common blood-borne virus among certain populations, like people who inject drugs that we were working with. And as I worked, in hepatitis C and started to engage more and more with the liver community and not just the infectious disease community, so meeting people like Jörn and Manuel, who I just mentioned, and so many other great liver experts, I would say it was more brought to my attention, the issue of fatty liver disease, because, I didn't study this 20 years ago in school or 10 years ago in, continuing education courses. It was there. I knew about it, but I didn't really realize how serious it was. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized we needed to take a public health and a health systems approach to it. That on the one hand, we didn't even have a good treatment. So whereas with HIV and hepatitis, it was about developing those treatments. And then when we had them, getting them to the people, taking an implementation science, a delivery science approach. Here, without those, we have some treatments, but not a specific, fatty liver disease treatment. I realized we had to take that public health approach. And that's really how I got into the field. And as I attended conferences, I've been going to the ILC regularly for 10 years, but off and on for 5 years, even before that, and the liver meeting in the US and other liver meetings, I realized that no one was really talking about fatty liver disease from that public health perspective. How do we take a whole of society approach? How do we take a people-centered approach? How do we think about things like, the kinds of models of care that really work for patients and even people before they become our patients who just need to know if this is something they should be worried about or not. So that's how I approached this. And I realized that there was an incredible appetite in the liver community, including among the clinicians, for this approach, but little knowledge about it because it wasn't something that was really taught in medical school. And it's not something that we really reward clinicians for. There weren't a lot of publications on the matter. It's hard to be remunerated. It's just not an approach we've really taken up. So helping to build stronger collaborations with other areas, obesity, diabetes, maybe even cardiology, and just thinking about how we can address this from a different angle is really the approach I'm taking.
Jeff, it strikes me listening to you that sounds less like a tsunami and more like being at sea in a ship during a storm that never ends. On the horizon, the sun is always clear, and every time you get to the horizon, there's another disease.
I guess the tsunami for me, though, is just recognizing that this is a massive, overwhelming wave of not just, I would say, problem, but problems, because this is a metabolic health issue hitting us. And yeah, we're on a ship at sea, but at the same time, I feel like the tsunami's past us and still going on at times.
I didn't get to the point where I talked about the 30-foot seas and the 50-knot winds, did I? Yeah, that's kind of what I envisioned, 10-meter seas and 50-knot winds. Go ahead, Jörn.
But Roger, let me chime in. And because, if I think back, the first paper I did with Jeff, or maybe the first one where I was real conscious about it, was we did a study on disease burden and the economic impact on NASH in 5 European countries. So that was 2018. And for me, everything was said. This is the disease burden. This is how much it costs. So now we need drugs and diagnostics. And Jeff kind of went back and said, no. There's a lot of things you got to settle before you can actually implement care. And I think in succession, and again, Jeff was a key driver here, there was 5 or 6 publications where we said, these are the models we want. This is the consensus. You got to talk to the people. You got to bring them all together and define what you want to achieve. Who are the stakeholders? And like he said, these are all the things, as a physician, I said, this is my patient. I want the drug. But until I get there, there's so much things that we got to actually untangle. And I think the whole process, and again, looping back to how Jeff and I got together, I think it started with cost, but since then, it's been some incredibly productive years in just pulling people together and getting this into a movement that I think finally leads up to the conference we're having now next month.
So, Jörn, on the way there, what was the biggest surprise to you?
Yeah, I think overall, under the leadership, again, of Jeff here, looking from the public health perspective, that we could actually come up with consensus involving, I think it's the consensus paper that we discussed on this podcast before, involving over 200 stakeholders in the field, and just to have, I think it was 3 Delphi rounds, and actually funnel down on the next important steps and get to an agreement. And I think, you have a lot of healthcare experts and physicians, an agreement of what is required now. And then from there, we can actually act. This is the time where we move it beyond the physician's office, where we move it to the regulators, to the healthcare authorities, to the people around us, to say, hey, this is a tsunami tsunami, you got to start acting, not just because the physician thinks so, but because we have a broad consensus here. This is the roadmap. This is how much it costs. So this approach is just much more structured than the single physician would take it from an individual patient.
Interesting. So, Jeff, before we go into the agenda, we'll get there in about one or two questions. How does NAFLD look the most like the other diseases you've been looking at? You mentioned one way in which it's different is that there are no clear therapeutic solutions here. What are some of the ways in which they look alike? And what are some other ways, other than the lack of clear drug choices, that they look really different to you?
Well, I would say NAFLD, reminds me of what it was like when I lived in the U.S. in the 80s and the president wouldn't even mention the word AIDS. There, at least, it was brought to his attention, but there was no public awareness, no real understanding. So NAFLD is just this unknown condition that has so many clinicians, I would say particularly liver specialists, and I don't want to say in a bit of a panic, but of great concern. And the rest of society doesn't know this is happening. So it's literally like a silence tsunami. I mean, it's that moment, when the water's going to hit and people don't even know that it looks calm out there, because we know that the prevalence, is estimated to be as high as like 1 in every 4 adults. So it reminds me of hepatitis C and HIV before they became well known. We have an incredible body of knowledge. The good thing, if there can be a good thing about high prevalence, is that, again, with AIDS, as it started to affect well-known people, as it reached high-income countries, that's when the attention turned to it. That's when pharmaceutical companies, really put the pedal to the metal. The drug development was accelerated and awareness was raised. And we have that situation starting to happen as we start to reach, unfortunately, well-known people and more people in high-income countries that are affected and even dying, as we're starting to pinpoint and narrow down, let's say, liver cancer attributable to fatty liver disease and end-stage liver disease and cirrhosis. We still don't always have good studies of attribution. As we realize the role fatty liver disease is playing, it helps us raise awareness among the decision makers, the policymakers, but also our clinical colleagues and even patient groups in other areas like obesity and diabetes.
So are you nodding or are you just thinking?
I was nodding and I was thinking something I haven't said before is, the connection with the patient groups and the advocacy groups. Jeff mentioned that it affects more and more people. I think the phenotype is different. This is also a disease that can give you some discrimination, if you'd like, or putting you in the middle of maybe not having achieved the weight goals that the physician has told you over and over again. Well, why don't you achieve that? So the individual patient is disadvantaged, or he feels bad about his disease. This is not comparable to HIV or infectious diseases, but it's a certain constellation where the patient himself is maybe guiltful about his disease. And that's, I think, where you got to start talking to the patient advocacy groups. And again, this is something also for the meeting next week, but I think in perspective that the public health experts brought in more broadly, and to move this beyond talking to an individual patient with individual guilt and his health problems and potentially social background that caused the disease. And here, the broader community of patients is available to be addressed. And actually, let's ask the patients, what do they want? What type of advice? What will help? What about people that were successful in implementing it? And it's so important to engage with them at that level of global or more broad patient advocacy.
It's interesting. As I'm listening, one of the things that strikes me, and you're right, Jörn, it's not the same level, but there are some really socially biasing misperceptions about the core diseases here, right? HIV was a disease just for gay people and then gay people and drug addicts. Not true, but that was the perception. The Hep C was entirely about people using needles for drugs. That might be where it started, but that certainly isn't where it ended. And you get the blood transfusions and partners and all this other stuff. Here, what we hear frequently from people come on the podcast is they tell their patients they have cirrhosis, and the patient says, but I don't drink alcohol. And you're right, Jörn, one of the things I used to see over and over again in marketing research, really everywhere in the world we worked, and they were the developed countries, but all of them, was that doctors had somewhere between frustration and contempt for obese patients that couldn't lose weight. That it was obviously a problem of willpower. We're now starting to understand that obesity is a disease, but in the same sense, there's a real miss on communication there. And I hear it as the same kind of thing, if not at the same degree. Does that feel right to you guys?
That feels absolutely right. I feel like we're in a better place than before, that not everyone associates liver disease with alcohol. Maybe I'm just because I'm in an environment where everybody doesn't do that all the time. But yeah, there's just that association. And the other issue, Roger, is the association of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease with being, overweight or obese. And we know that there's a decent sized percentage of those with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, that aren't obese either. So, you get this disease, you're not overweight, you're not drinking excessive alcohol, and that's what everybody thinks you're doing. So, we have this huge problem with stigma and discrimination and the name. And if we have time, I'll mention we are embarking now on a large consensus statement, a nomenclature consensus statement to rethink the name and the implications of the current name and a possible name change.
Which is a subject I will note if we get there of hearty debate. And I could put another set of people on next week and go in a completely different direction on that. We'll see. Why don't we take that as a lead in and let's go to the opening session on Friday, May 6th, starting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Barca 7 and Barca 7 in the morning here. And first session is on epidemiology and disease burden. It says measuring a silent condition. What do you expect that session will achieve? What are the three speakers looking to do? And where do you think all that goes?
I'll jump in because there's going to be sessions where I will rely much more heavily on Jörn, even if we're developing this program together as the joint co-chairs of the meeting. This first session, sure, we can say the epidemiology is roughly 1 in 4 adults, and we're not entirely sure among children. But we want to get at, what's the epidemiology, the critical epidemiology in other conditions. So in diabetes, in obesity, we want to start to look at the relationships and attribution between cardiovascular disease and fatty liver disease. So we want to go one step further and really understand where this fits in terms of metabolic health and where there's that interplay and overlap, and look at it from that epidemiological perspective. So it's a scene setting. So this isn't just there's a lot of people with fatty liver disease and we need to do something about it. It's epidemiology for action. So this is the situation. If you're a cardiologist and you're looking at your guidelines or you're thinking about your patients and you're not thinking about the liver at all, then there is a problem. I'm not saying it's got to be your top priority, but when we review the cardiological guidelines and we don't see liver mentioned except for the word to deliver on better cardiological outcomes, we have a problem. And so it's really to look at that kind of epi for action.
Jeff, I like the way you said this session is set up, right? I mean, first, Zobair talking about public health agenda. Zobair said something at CLDF I thought was really interesting. You and I had talked last fall, I'd asked you on this podcast, about would there be consequences with payers if we said more than 1 in 4? And you said, yeah, that was a concern. Zobair actually made the comment at CLDF that the number might not be 25. It might be starting to look more like 30% of the adult population. I don't know that he had data for that or just that he was taking a look at a variety of different prospective studies, but I was intrigued to hear that. So that's number one. And then the idea of Sven coming on and talking about liver heart axis, and then Cyril Kelsey, who I don't know, but who I've heard speak, talking about the metabolic triple. It feels like that's constructed to do exactly what you said, right? Say to people, here's the scale of NASH, and here are the bad places that you go from there. If you will, kind of the tsunami highway. Jörn, any comments to add about that session?
We're trying to be a little provocative, and we called it how to measure a silent condition, right? And this is something we've struggled with the field, because if you look into the big databases, and Zubair has done a lot of great studies in this, there's always so much gray zone and uncertainty about the true prevalence, and not speaking about the coding of the disease. So how can you make informed public health decisions if the disease is not coded? This is one of the major challenges, and he's just in a great position to talk about all this exciting analysis he led and detail that. The other thing that you'll see throughout the program, and that's been very specifically designed by us to do so, is we'll have that combination of people coming in. You mentioned the cardiologist. We have Cyril Kelsey here. She's an endocrinologist, actually, from France, from Lyon. And she'll bring in a very unique perspective of how endocrinologists and physicians that predominantly treat patients with type 2 diabetes are seeing this disease. She's clearly biased towards NASH, has been working in San Diego, I believe, for a long time and doing a lot of MRI studies with Rohit Lumba, but she'll be a great addition to this first session.
I'll just add, if I may, Roger, right now, I don't think the question is it 25%, 28%, 30%, or as low as 22% adult prevalence? I mean, I trained as an epidemiologist. I'd love to know the numbers to the third decimal and stratified in every possible way, whether it's region, education, age, sex, gender, etc. But the point is that it's an incredible number. And it's an incredible number in certain settings. We know that. We know in diabetes clinics, some estimates as high as 70% of people in certain settings will have, NAFLD, and yet they're not even getting a FIB4 or any other non-invasive tests on a regular basis. So we are going to be scientific conference meeting. We'll be looking for, very exact numbers to the extent we can. But it's a little bit like with AIDS and hepatitis C early on. Later, as estimates got better, those numbers came down quite a bit. Remember in Hep C, the estimate in 2015 was 71 million. And when the tools got better, it came down to 58 million for 2015. And it wasn't really because because we were treating our way out of it and preventing so many cases. It was better modeling. And the same thing with HIV. When they got better modeling in India and Nigeria 20 years ago, they were able to bring down those numbers. So maybe these numbers will change. Probably not drastically, but even if they do change some percentages, it's not like it's going to go from 25 to 1%.
Because I'm a marketer by training, I'm a few things by training. One is a marketer, and I'm a huge fan of the idea of threshold theory and just noticeable differences, right? Which is why you never find an item in a store anywhere in the world for $10 euro pounds 0.05. It's always $9.95 because at 10 it feels like it's a threshold. I've always thought a quarter is one of those numbers. The 28 just looks bigger than 25 in a way that 25 doesn't look bigger than 22. So I took note of that. And I think your point, Jeff, is dead on right. The other point, though, which is also right, and you just made this one, is that once people understand this is really a big thing, even if the numbers come down because the estimating gets better, once it's imprinted that this is a big deal, a really big deal, it tends to stay that way in people's minds. No one goes later, oh, pish, it's only 58, not 71 million. 58 still sounds like a pretty big number. And if 71 got people's attention, that's just kind of how it worked.
Yeah, remember, in hepatitis C, with the absolutely amazing treatments we have, and really a lot of awareness now, and a World Hepatitis Day, and WHO addressing it, and half the countries in the world with a strategy, it's thought that the majority of people with hepatitis C aren't even diagnosed. In many countries, maybe even a third of people with HIV are not diagnosed. So we're really a long way off in NAFLD, and I think it's going to be quite slow going. And I know there's some concern sometimes among the payers, but even if we get a treatment and a lot of people need it, it's going to be a while to find these people.
Which is a great segue, by the way, to your second session titled Screening and Risk Stratifying for NAFLD, Who and Where. So let's talk a little bit about that session.
Thanks, Roger. And I think this is how we wanted to set it up, talk about the disease burden and then about screening next. And we have Emmanuel Chukchatzis there, who is, in a great position. He's a co-author of the recent non-invasive diagnostic testing guidelines produced by EASL governing board member. And he will really give us an update on innovative pathways, risk stratifications in general, using NITs, where do we stand? And then actually hands-on experience from John Dillon from Dundee, who has done a fabulous job in implementing an automated system, iLiver, ILFT, and a system where you can actually have computer act on abnormal tests and then refer for additional testing. So I think one strategy that, if being rolled out in different settings, could really help expedite the diagnostic rates. This is a reason why I'm excited about this one, because you get an augmentation. So even if you do not have a hepatologist sitting in a practice, let's say a diabetologist's practice, you could still screen for liver disease there and then recommend the patients with advanced disease we want to take care of as hepatologists.
Yeah, I thought it was striking that the chair of the session is Ken Kusi, who's an endocrinologist, and then after Manolis, the other two papers are fundamentally about general practice, right?
Right on. And we're still hoping to get a primary care physician who is ready to join us here and give his perspective, because again, they're seeing so many patients, and to use a Harrison quote here, greet them and street them in 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how busy your practice is. I mean, the least concern is going to be a slightly elevated ALT, and that could be the cirrhotic patients where you're going to have cancer 2 years down the line. And we really need to augment these physicians to enable them and identify that at-risk patient that sometimes for an experienced hepatologist is difficult to pick out. That's the point where we really need to start talking to each other, and I'm very excited to have them on board and give their perspective here.
Fantastic. Other thoughts on this session, Jeff?
Jörn did a great job of showing how we have these incredible speakers with these experiences. We can automate FIB4 and find these abnormal liver function tests if it's too much work, to read the results for individuals, or if they're simply missed in the process. And there's lots of interesting examples now of even bypassing with permission doctors so that the labs can perform these tests and then provide the information back if it meets the cutoffs. So it's really, the story now is about risk stratification. It's about when to refer, when to wait, but also about raising awareness. And we had similar discussions with hepatitis C. In the beginning, it was reimbursement restrictions, and with the limitations we had, we were going to treat the F4 cases and the F3 cases. And then we realized, actually, we need to treat everyone with the virus. We'll see what happens with NAFLD and what happens in the drug pipeline, which is a long pipeline. It's going to take a while. But right now, we need to risk stratify to make sure we get those cirrhotic cases, those liver cancer cases, to the specialists. And at the same time, I at least believe, and I'm not sure I have the evidence for this, but I believe that if people are aware that they have a liver problem, even if it's not a serious problem. It's one more reason for them to, exercise more, eat more healthily, and so on.
Yeah, I think I agree with that for some people, not all people, but it's a game of inches, and I think or a game of yards or meters. And the point that you're making that I totally agree with is that there are a lot of people who would do that if they knew who do not know. Not everybody, but lots of people. Wayne Eskridge famously tells a story about finding out that he'd been gaining weight for 30 years and he had cirrhosis, and he and his wife went home, emptied out their cabinet, and over the next decade he lost 70 pounds and restored most of his normal liver function. And he said if he'd known 20 years earlier, he just would have handled his life differently. Now, he's a high visibility example, but I have friends with similar stories, a lot less dramatic than that. Not that everybody will do that, but lots of people will.
And just to reinforce it, Roger, this is at the heart of the physician-patient interaction. The physician is the one that informs the patient and leaves him the choice to do with it what he wants to do with it. But for this, we have to have all the information. We got to enable our patients to then act or not act, which is their choice.
So can I enroll both you guys in my movement to make the phrase liver function tests a swear word where you got to put 20 of the currency of your choice in the jar every time you use the phrase?
I will. Did I say liver function test?
Actually, you did. It says ILFT, right, which is a whole different thing. But usually when doctors talk about liver function tests, it's based on the idea that AST and ALT actually mean something in this context. And as you pointed out, they don't. So I was actually writing on your example of why it's important to do that as compared to saying, no, you already used the bad word. So then we move on to session 3, how to manage patients with NAFLD in different healthcare facilities, which starts again in primary care, right?
Yeah, here you go. I think this is something we really wanted to have for this meeting to get all these different perspectives. And the management is probably, every time we talk about identification, why should I identify the patient? Now, you said just a few seconds ago a very important thing. I think it's about empowerment of the patient. But what can the physician do? And here, again, we have Helen Jarvis from Newcastle. She's involved in a number of research projects and academic work, but also a primary care physician. I think she'll do a brilliant job just to highlight what are the opportunities and what are the limitations you're facing if you're aiming to manage these patients in primary care. The UK system, I think that came up a couple of times on this podcast, is a little special because it follows very precise rules and barriers, and that can be helpful. In certain referral situations, it can be bothersome because you're not free to do what you want with the patient. And I'm very excited to hear her talk on this. And then this is actually where we have the nutritionists come in. Shira Selvasaji from the University of Haifa in Tel Aviv Medical Center. She's a renowned expert. She did so many great papers on the effects of macronutrients. There's a big paper on red meat consumption and NAFLD driven by her group. So this should be also very interesting and exciting talk. And then finally, things we can do today is about talking to the patient in primary care, adding nutritionists, and potentially weight management, which is an effective strategy, but not available to all patients, maybe not useful for all patients, maybe not being reimbursed for all patients. And we have a colleague here that will address bariatric interventions, may it be endoscopic or even surgical.
One of the interesting things Shira and our research group are doing as a nutritionist, and linked to a liver unit, they can engage at the individual level, how to improve your diet. And we know that that's challenging in the longer term. And they're looking at studies, about how to facilitate that. But she also looks at structural issues. And she was a part of the EASL Lancet Liver Commission and raising, really sounding the alarm on like ultra processed foods. And like Jörn said, studies on red meat. But I mean, there are just issues where it's hard to eat a healthy diet, even when you try, because the food isn't always easily available. And if you don't have a lot of money, often the food is of worse quality. And we know that ultra processed foods are often quite inexpensive and some of the most harmful things to be eating. So she's looking at things really from an individual and a structural perspective. And she'll be getting at that in her talk, so we can change things one by one, but also in one go.
I'll be intrigued to hear that. I mean, as we all know, microbiome is getting a lot more attention these days, and microbiome and the kind of things that Dr. Zelvasaji talks about have a bunch to do with each other. So I'll be interested in that. From the perspective of the podcast, one of the most successful episodes we had last year was the 7:00 talk, the Professor Crespo's talk about bariatric. And what we were talking about was the Splendor study at a Cleveland clinic, where they were able to show that if you could, through bariatric surgery, cause a 20% drop in weight and hold it for 12 months, you could regress FAT4 back to F3 in a significant portion of patients. So I'm wondering whether this talk is targeted at that kind of thing or something a lot more basic. Where do you expect the talk is going to take you?
Yeah, I think the talk will go directly to the clinical evidence we're seeing. It will review the studies and meta-analysis in bariatrics, but it will also talk about the endoscopic procedures and how the NITs that we have available are changing. They're now histology-based trials. So it will review the evidence because we want to be practical and we want to send the message on what can be done in the management today. This is something that will be very conclusive in this case.
So before we go go on to the second day. Simple question. If the target attendee walked out of the first day's session with a thought balloon hanging over their head, what would you want that thought balloon to say?
For me, it would be something along the lines like, there's a lot more to fatty liver disease than I realized. There's a lot more my colleagues and I can do. It's not all hopeless. On the one hand, we do need to change the world, but there's also a lot of changes we can make stepwise.
And I do see the primary care physician that has the thought balloon or maybe the question raising. And I thought I didn't have to act on that elevated liver enzyme because he felt either, he's not in the position to do so, or the specialist should take care of it. But I'd like to really empower the other co-physicians or the physicians that seen most of these patients, actually, the endocrinologists and the primary care, to get a strategy or to get to know the strategy on how to address these patients and not to worry about all patients they're seeing, because they're seeing a lot. Jeff mentioned up to 70%, but to identify the right patient that's going to develop cirrhosis and cancer in a reasonably short time where we can prevent this. And I think this is at the heart of the responsibility of the physician.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. My thought balloon as a naive observer just had the word yikes in it, or oh wow, or something like that. Level of registering scope of problem compared to anticipated scope of problem. The other thing I'm interested by in the context of what you just said, Jörn, is you go back to if you go back to the talk from Professor Dillon, right? When you're talking about primary care, it's unlikely that they're going to compute FIB-4s, for example, on their own, even if they know how to do it. I mean, this is Stevens, Greedham, and Streetum thing again. They don't have a lot of time. They've got tons of space they need to cover, and this isn't anywhere near their wheelhouse. So we talked about this in the context of cholesterol, that what started moving cholesterol in the U.S. was when the labs stopped reporting an abnormally high value as being 2 standard deviations above the mean and took it down to a predefined number. So if we can start automating FIB-4s and then putting a flashing red arrow next to it, that in and of itself will do more to move awareness because people will know they're supposed to do something than if we ask them to do it on their own.
I agree. And just to follow up on this, I mean, John Dillon and his group has done a tremendous job, and liver function tests are so intimately linked to liver disease. But there are other ways. You can have the machine calculate based on risk factors, obesity, type 2 diabetes, presence, and age above 55 and predict, even if you don't have a single test on the liver, you can stratify these patients. There's a paper out that we discussed here in the podcast some time ago, uses a couple of numbers in a machine learning algorithm or clinical characteristics. I think there are many ways. And if somebody walks away and says, I'm going to rethink how I structure and see these patients or develop a new tool to identify them in primary care, this is one goal that would then be achieved.
I mean, I completely agree with you on this. There's different ways to stratify. And, we can have long debates, and we do, about the utility and the accuracy of FIB-4 or another non-invasive test. We're going to miss some people. There's going to be issues around false and negative predictive values. But we're doing so little right now. And there's a lot we can do. And I think we're at that stage where we're not even doing some of the basic stuff. And there I understand it's a challenge at the primary care level in general practice, but I certainly look to the diabetes field and endocrinology to be doing a lot more among their patients, even though I know there's often willingness, but many of them are also have their hands full.
Well, then theoretically better tools will help, right? Which is why you get back to things like automating lab scores and rethinking when to get people to pay attention, which I always thought has been huge. Attentive to calendar. Let's move on to the second day, which starts with a patient organization session. Interesting title. What did you have in mind?
Well, Jörn's going to chair, so I'll turn to him to say more. But for me, it's just essential to make sure that the patients, that community groups are involved in everything we do. And certainly every meeting, and to the extent possible, even some of the papers and research I'm involved in. So we want to have the patient voice. We want that patient voice to be mainstreamed throughout the events. I mean, the patients are invited to be there the whole time. And I think this will be a meeting that will be of particular interest to them, because there'll be many sessions that are a little less clinical than at some of the large liver congresses, where they may not always be able to, some of them may not be able to follow. So it's really, I don't mean that in any disparaging way. I can't follow them all either. We just want to make sure that the patients also have a specific session for their voices, because in a way we could say the clinicians' sessions, for a lot of these, it's funny, we pull out the patients and say, this is for them, but, and there are also patients who are, clinicians and vice versa. So this is a chance for them to share their experiences. And again, looking back to the playbook in HIV and biohepatitis C, it's been so important. And it was first in 2015 that the hepatitis C patient groups met for the very first time. They met in Scotland. They got together and they made that movement, and they created the No-Hep movement. And so this is just one small contribution to give the patients a chance to speak together and to speak to all of us, both the audience and to all of the other faculty.
Yeah, and I think the involvement of patients, we're going to see it again at the roundtable discussion, Roger, that you'll be moderating, is something that really excites me about day 2. So if I'd have to choose, I'd probably choose day 2, because really this is where you're going to get the different perspective on the disease. You're going to hear more than automated liver function tests or additional risk stratifications. I think this is where the group that's affected, the group that either you're trying to develop a test for or a treatment, what's their perspective on this? And there's so many facets to the disease. Achim Kautz is going to join me. He's from Germany, so I worked with him before, and I know they've been doing some very interesting studies, doing milieu studies, looking at where do these patients actually come from in a country like Germany that's particularly wealthy, well-educated. You have lots of resources to reach people and educate them. Still, we're seeing obesity and NAFLD rates that are just incredibly high, and he really reached out to see, where are these NAFLD cases being generated? Where can we then, for example, address prevention strategies better? So I think this is something very interesting. It brings in a different perspective. And again, what do these patients say? What do they need? What would help them? Because sometimes as a physician, I say, if I tell him he has a high liver enzyme, this will help him to focus on the liver enzyme, get it down. But maybe there's this, of course, that's not the right answer. But what does the patient need? And I can only, from my very limited physician's perspective, think about this. So this is really an exciting opening session for me, and a round table. Again, I'll be chairing and asking questions, but I think there's going to be so much input just from these advocacy groups to educate us on disease and what's needed.
That's fascinating. And I found the next session that you're chairing, the first before session, the talks that you chose to put together under that title, right? Multidisciplinary management, and then Jeff talking about road to comprehensive models, and Alina talking about integrating non-invasive tests and clinical practice outside liver space, and then Marcus Rani talking about digital innovation and apps transforming weight management. A really interesting set of topics to pull together into one session. So what were you looking for there?
So I think we're going to start out with a roadmap on the comprehensive models of care, just to say, where do we have to go? After we heard the patient, now what's the consensus that was developed in the public health arena? And then which tests can we use? And today we have so much innovation in digital tools. So the last talk by Marcus Rennie is going to be very exciting, just to hear how could this help us? If we know the endpoints, if we know how we could use these different tests, how can we use the power of digital innovation to then bring this to the patients?
I have to admit, I'm not particularly familiar with his work or with that company. What do they do? What are they about?
I invited Marcus. I'll confess I haven't known him for a long time, but had a unique opportunity to walk with him for 6 days. Didn't know who he was, didn't know who really anybody was, but we climbed Mount Kilimanjaro together. So we talked. And when I found out he was a clinician trained in London, working on metabolic health, interested in fatty liver disease, but also the whole interaction around longevity and what makes our bodies work and how we can improve health outcomes through digital, I thought I wasn't going to be working on that trip, but I do confess we did have a lot of walk and talk for days. There was nothing else to do, no internet, no nothing. And I invited him to join the Wilton Park meeting that the International Liver Foundation held on NAFLD. And he just gave a really brilliant, short input on the power of digital transformation. And I feel like our field needs to understand that better. I mean, we're all digital in some ways. Some people can book an appointment online. There's electronic medical records in some centers, but he's looking at, apps and tools and how to harness existing tools, whether it's a Fitbit or an Oura Ring or the steps you're walking, and bring that together to come with some biohacks to help, try and improve your health on a regular basis. So it's really just to give us a sort of an injection of what digital transformation, what digital possibilities there are for us. Because when you get to a patient and you've made these recommendations and you're not going to see them for another year because they're NF0, we want to leave them with something. And it might be this kind of recommendation of an app or other tools that can help them in a hopefully not too invasive way to improve their diet and their exercise. So when we see them next time, things haven't progressed.
Great. Well, this is my Garmin watch, and my wife works for Noom, so I'm certainly bought into this entire message in a big way, and I'll be interested to hear specifically what he wants to talk about, particularly since he'll be part of that panel in the afternoon as well. All right, so we go through lunch, we come back, and then we go to drugs, pharmacotherapeutics, if you will.
Yeah, so we're planning with an industry session before the lunch too, then actually lead over and talk about future pharmacotherapeutic therapeutics, because I think this is one of the most exciting fields. Of course, many concepts we've discussed in this podcast here too, and we have excellent speakers. Naeem Al-Khoury is going to join us from Arizona Liver Health to talk about the pharmacotherapy specifically addressing obesity. And I hope you'll find that, again, we're trying to address these three lines, may it be primary care endocrinologists and hepatologists, or these three pillars of NAFLD, namely obesity, diabetes, and liver disease. So following Naeem talking on pharmacotherapy for obesity, we'll have Ken Kuzi discuss diabetes drugs that have been shown to provide a benefit. So if you're sitting in front of an NAFLD patient today and you heard those first two talks, you know what to do. You know how you could potentially use an available drug that's been approved for diabetes to give the patient a liver benefit. And then finishing up, we have Stephen Harrison with us talking about liver-directed drugs in the pipeline for fibrotic NASH. And again, I think everybody who's listened to this podcast has known how brilliant Stephen can summarize that, and very excited to hear him speak on this topic.
I'm intrigued to see the dynamic because I know, for example, that Ken might be a little more skeptical about some of the fibrotic drugs. So watching the two of them next to each other might be an interesting thing in its own right. And if Ken's going to talk about GLP-1s, it'll be interesting to see what else Naeem talks about, because I assume that's part of what Ken will speak about. But I think that should be a fascinating session. Hopefully it'll be as eye-opening for the audience, or some in the audience, as it was for me the first time I got exposed to these things a couple of years ago. I just thought it was remarkable and really vision-changing to learn about the drugs for the first time. So hopefully there'll be people in the audience who will get the benefit of that experience. Jeff, anything to add before we go on?
Nothing to really add from my side other than that I really look forward to this session, as all the sessions, but there's so much to learn. I mean, where are we at this point in time? This is a session that just needs to always happen, so we can always get that kind of update.
Okay, so then there's a roundtable session on discussion of public health roadmap to comprehensive care for NASH, opening the session, and then that kind of immediately goes into the session I'm moderating, which kind of feels like it's everything, except maybe everything except drugs. And if you look at the panel, it is everything except drugs, which I think should be really intriguing. I'm delighted that you were able to get Donna to come. I think she has a fantastic perspective on this stuff. Like I said, I will reach out to Marcus at some point before the conference because I want to understand better. But what do you envision this discussion will wind up being about?
For me, I mean, I think this will be a chance to actually, I mean, although Jörn and I have the closing words, almost, immediately after it, this is a chance to really revisit issues that have come up that maybe we didn't have enough time for, or that were mentioned in one session, but now we have someone who had been in a different session and they can really engage on it as well. So it is a bit of a catch-all session. I couldn't think of anyone better to moderate it than you, Roger. So that's why
it's like, thank you. It's like the podcast, right? I mean, you just take things and you weave them together. I'm excited about it for exactly that reason, because this is a diverse bunch of perspectives and we can get to a lot of things. So I think that'll be really cool.
And I know you're going to ask the tough questions and don't let them off the hook. I want to see their ideas and their roadmap on the respective topics and know how I can propel this and move it beyond hepatology or some liver doctors meeting in a dark hallway discussing fibrosis stages. This is a disease that affects all these people. We need the roadmap. We need engagement. And I think that's at the heart of this meeting.
Now, are you two going to be part of I haven't asked. Are you two going to be part of this session as well, or just the four panelists? Here's the question behind the question. If you're not, there's no hepatologist. So I thought that was an interesting decision, if that's the decision.
It's funny. I was just going to say, notice that this is, clinician who's endocrinologist. This is nutrition. This is digital health. This is patient. Is that the future of fatty liver disease? Probably not. But are those four groups that are rarely a part of the discussion? Yes, all the time. As we're finalizing the program now, and this is a session that Jörn and I are chairing, that Jörn, correct me if I'm wrong, that, we're going to be a part of this discussion, even if we're not sort of the named panelists. We're opening, we're closing, we're speaking. So we really want to give other people, to the extent possible, the chance to shine and give their version of the NAFLD narrative.
So I think, look, I'm really excited about this. I've been up for this since the day you asked. And as I mentioned to Jeff, I'm hoping next year you don't do this on Mother's Day weekend in the U.S. Not necessarily a popular choice in my household, but or others I know of, but just a fantastic session. And as I said, if you couldn't get me to miss it for Mother's Day, you couldn't get me to miss it for much. So it's a big thing. All right, we're at the end of our hour. So I think we're just about where we want to be time-wise. It says on the agenda that the last thing are closing words. So what I'm going to ask you two to do today is share closing words with this focus. If I'm listening to this podcast and I'm a hepatologist or a different kind of physician or not a physician, why do I want to be at this meeting? All three perspectives. Brave one, go first.
I'm not sure I'm brave, but I'll start. This is a session where you're going to hear about future pharmacotherapeutics. You're going to get what you often get at other meetings, but you're going to get a lot more because we're going to be talking about the multidisciplinary management. We're going to be engaging with patients. We're going to be looking at NAFLD in other settings. So these are the settings that are going to be referring patients in need to you. It's an amazing faculty. We're going to be in Barcelona.
Nothing much to add to that, Roger. I would just say, we're going to end up with the right content that's needed outside of the world of hepatology. I'm not thinking there's no need for hepatologists there in the panel discussion. Clearly there is. This disease has been driven by hepatologists, and I think we've left some key stakeholders behind or haven't talked with them enough yet. And this is really the time where we want to come up with this. The next step is we got to engage politicians. We got to engage payers. We need their perspective, and really to innovate the care, to be able to provide care. We need all these people. And just speaking to patients as we have them in the program a number of times, we'll get the right words that we know what do we need to give to our politicians to then come up with regulations and enable to be able to provide care.
Okay, thanks, Jörn. It struck me since I got involved with this disease, though, it made it so fascinating, was that it was like cancer in 1969 in terms of how little we knew about the disease, coupled with a massive social issues. I mean, cancer had smoking around it, but other than that, it wasn't basically about social behaviors. Here, you've got multiple social behaviors, multiple social stigmas, multiple social misconceptions, and a disease nobody entirely understands. If you like complexity, this really is the candy shop, And the way to start to tease it apart, at least to say, well, this is where the lollipops are and this is where the chocolates are, is I think to do the kind of thing you're doing here and present the whole candy shop one shelf at a time and allow people to figure out what they want to make of it. So I'm not sure candy shop is a great metaphor to use for liver disease. Please forgive, there's way too much fat and sugar in that for anybody's comfort. But if you move that to a somewhat healthier place, we were joking before in a different context about a drinking game, and I suggested we would do a drinking game with cleanse, and then Jörn said that was like too hard to bear. So we decided the drinking game for NASH has got to be with black coffee. But there's got to be some kind of metaphor there about the candy shop as well. But I think this very neatly encompasses the complexity of what's going on. And I commend both of you guys for it and thrilled to be a part of it. And with that, I'll be back with the business report in a minute, and I will see you gents next month in Barcelona.
And now for the Season 3, Episode 18 Business Report.
To our Ukrainian friends and colleagues, Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. As pictures of the various civilian slaughters in Ukraine become available around the world, we were even more saddened than before, and our hearts go out to Ukrainian friends and total strangers who have to live through this horror. Let us hope it ends as soon as possible. It can't possibly end soon enough. Soon enough would be 5 minutes from now. And with that, let's just dive into our announcements.
We have media partnerships to announce.
Given the recent episode topic, this seems like a good time to discuss all our upcoming conference partnerships. Clearly, we are partners with the Innovation in NAFLD Care 2022 conference in Barcelona, May 6th, May 7th, and I've spoken already about our media partnership with the 5th Global NASH Congress being held in London, May 26th and 27th. Our most important partnership for the second quarter is with EASL for the International Liver Congress, what people just call the EASL meeting, which will be held as a hybrid conference in London on June 22nd through June 26th. We will expand our coverage this year, including daily wrap-ups for at least 2, probably 3 of the days, one-on-one interviews with people presenting key papers and posters, and attendance at review after the daily press briefings. We can do that because I'll be there at the meeting in Louisville as well. If your corporation would like to sponsor any part of our coverage, please reach out to let me know by emailing me personally at roger.green@hepdynamics.com.
Let's focus a bit on April.
Next week, Jörn will be back with Stephen, Naeem Al-Khoury, and Mazen Nuruddin to share their thoughts about what the NAIL NIT retrospective analyses might be able to tell us. Also, we'll have at least one major announcement next week, so keep your ears peeled and make sure to listen to our podcast. On April 25th, we will preview the 5th Global NASH Congress. That Congress is more commercial than most of the meetings we cover, but last year's Global NASH Congress was steeped in cutting-edge diagnostic discussions from companies like Glimpse and Metabolomics. We look forward to more exciting presentations of this nature this year, and we'll be talking about them in a couple of weeks. We are still exploring 2 options for the week of April 18th. Each is different from anything we've done before at Tsunami. I'll make a final announcement about that next week.
The buzz gets buzzier, and the vault selections keep changing.
On the buzz front, this week sets a Tsunami record for consistency, our 5th straight week of over 1,000 downloads. As I said last week, March closed as our 2nd largest month ever, with over 5,300 downloads, and April is starting strong as well. The vault items this past week have not been from the distant past, but E15 on the CLDF review has had an extremely strong first 3 weeks, and E16 on data modeling a very strong first 2. Normally, 52 to 55% of our downloads come from episodes more than a month old, but this past week that number was 38%, meaning 5 out of every 8 were from recent material. Given how well the 2 episodes I just mentioned are performing, and the exciting start that E17 has gotten off to, I think this is more about the quality of the recent episodes than anything in the past. And with that, we're done. I want to thank our team, Magic Mike, Eric, Steve, Murph the Magnificent, for a typically productive week and working on the items that will result in big announcements next week. This team is the best, as are you, our listeners. On general principle, I usually include you at the end of my thank yous, this week more strongly than most, as we see significant new opportunities for this podcast while simultaneously facing significant new challenges. Our sense of purpose grows stronger, the dent we want to put in fatty liver disease grows larger and deeper, and we find ourselves reaffirmed daily. And with that, I'm off. Stay safe, surf on. I look forward to seeing you again next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com and we will answer on the podcast or the website.